I know that everybody loves writing learning objectives, so I'm going to show you why you need to write them and how to write good ones. Learning objectives enable you to have a framework for the session development. They provide some guidance for how you can evaluate the learners, and they really make you limit the content and prevent sending your learners into cognitive overload. So what's the usual process that happens when we write learning objectives? We start by making our lecture, and then we get one of these emails. Really? At that point, you then write your learning objectives by some kind of a process like this. And these are typical examples of the type of learning objectives that you end up with if you do a process in that order. But this process needs to be flipped. It needs to be, what do they need to learn, not what do I want to teach. So teacher-centric teaching involves you asking questions such as, what should I teach? What will I cover? How will I cover it? But it's really not about you, it's about the learners. So questions that are more learner-centric are these such as, what should they know beforehand? What should they be able to do by the end of the session? How will my session guide them to achieve those goals? Your learning objectives need to be smart. They need to be specific. They need to be measurable. They need to be attainable in their setting and in the time frame. They need to be directed to relevant learning and targeted to the appropriate level of learning. For any teaching session, you will have a core objective, and then you will have a number of supporting objectives. Think of your core objective as your destination, and the supporting objectives of how you get to that destination. So this might be a core objective for a session on contrast. And these might be your supporting objectives for this session. Please note that each of these has an active verb associated with it. These active verbs identify the skills that they should acquire. They distinguish between lower and higher level learning, and they direct you to potential means of evaluation. For example, one of the active verbs on the prior slide was protocol, so you can test them by having them protocol various patient scenarios. If you look on the web, you will find lists of active verbs that are associated with different levels of Bloom's taxonomy of learning objectives, where you start with a lower level learning objective such as remember, and move up to higher level learning objectives such as create. And by selecting some of these active verbs in this list, it can really help you direct your learning objectives, particularly into those higher levels. Another way of thinking about this is the learner becomes increasingly skilled as they move up this pyramid from knows how, shows how, and then does. So for example, they know how to list common presentations of contrast reactions. They can match the presentation with appropriate treatment. They can identify high-risk patients and protocol them appropriately. And then finally, they're able to manage acute contrast reactions in a simulated environment. So what are our rules for writing learning objectives? It should be the first task in developing the session. So you do this before you make your slides. It's going to direct what the rest of the talk is going to be, or the rest of the active learning session. They should focus on necessary skills and knowledge. Generally speaking, you should not have more than about 5 per session. Otherwise, you're really going to send them into cognitive overload. Use active verbs. Include some active verbs, some higher Bloom's levels. And you want them to be testable even if you're not going to test them. So theoretically, you should be able to test the learners if they acquire that information or that skill. Learning objectives can be thought of as broadly having this framework. So at the end of the session, the learner should be able to add your active verb. You want to include the setting, so they're as specific as possible. Your learning objectives want to relate to information that they actually need to know. Are they clear enough? Do the learners know what they should be able to do by the end of the session? Can you reasonably attain these objectives in the time and setting available? They have to be targeted appropriately to the specific learner group or groups that you're teaching. And finally, can you at least theoretically assess whether they learned this skill or knowledge? I hope this zip through learning objectives has been helpful for you. Thanks for listening.